a term of hypothesis was used in relation to Old Testament literature, and that term was called the documentary hypothesis. And I'm going to give you quite an oversimplification of this, but this documentary hypothesis was often designated by different letters. The letters are J, E, D, P. And the J relates to Yahweh, the E relates to Elohim, the D relates to Deuteronomic point of view, and P relates to priestly point of view. Now, and you say, well, why is J relating to Yahweh? Well, much of the early formation of this documentary hypothesis was done in Germany, and of course there the term Jehovah is the German transliteration of the term Yahweh, and so they used the J, which relates to Yahweh or to Jehovah. And basically it worked something like this: as they observed different passages of Scripture, they noticed that in those passages terms referring to God predominantly may have referred to Yahweh as God, and other passages may have predominantly referred to the term Elohim as relating to God. Now, it doesn't mean that they didn't use the other term within them, but then they came up with a guess. Why is this so? And they began to formulate the hypothesis that there were different editors who were pulling together different stories and oral traditions and pulled them together and made a document, so to speak, and so they would refer to that as the J document or J collection of documents. And the same with Elohim. These came from another standpoint and were pulled together. And then the D referred to a Deuteronomic point of view. In other words, that's the point of view of the law, relating a lot to the law, and also maybe that would be a prophetic point of view. And then the P was from a priestly point of view, and so it was as though there were perhaps 4 different editors that came together and they formed these bodies of literature and brought them together, and then those were used as the formation for the different Old Testament books that we have. And so that's an oversimplification, but it has some elements of what is taking place whenever you start using hypotheses. And so we use the term form criticism because that related to those types of forms. Well, now the term criticism itself, sometimes we think, well, criticism is putting people down or trying to tear something apart. And that's not the case of the definition of the word. Criticism, as applied in our discussion, refers to a careful evaluation or analysis of written material. And so certainly we should not have a problem with evaluating or analyzing the New Testament. We often do that whenever we formulate sermons. We have to analyze, especially analyze, and then we also evaluate which text we're going to use. Well, now that is how we use criticism in our class. Now, thinking of the regular use of the word, like whenever someone puts you down or something like that, been told we should be reminded that we should not allow criticism to bother us, because if it had any power to hurt, the skunk would be extinct. Now, again, I want to ask you to read carefully the materials of your assignments and also the PowerPoint slides because not everything to be tested will be covered in these videos, or perhaps even in the PowerPoint slides. So you do have to pay careful attention to your reading assignments. However, we'll say this, that probably over 70% of the material that will be tested will be emphasized either in these videos or in the PowerPoint slides. Well, we talked about form criticism, and I would like to look at page 80 in our textbook. And on page 80, there were 6 assumptions and beliefs that came to be the basis for form criticism. So we will look at those 6 assumptions. Yes. Okay, the first one is that the stories and sayings of Jesus circulated in small independent units. The early form critics argued that an exception to this rule was the Passion narrative, which they thought was a self-contained literary unit from a very early period. Even this exception is not admitted by many contemporary form critics. Second, the transmission of the gospel material can be compared to the transmission of other folk and religious traditions. Responsibility for this transmission rests not with individuals, but with a community within which the material takes shape and is handed down. Certain laws of transmission generally observable in such instances of oral transmission can be applied to the transmission of the Gospels. Okay, another assumption approaching the Gospels as related to form criticism is that the form of a specific story or saying makes it possible to determine its setting in life or function in the life of the early church. According to Bultmann, the proper understanding of form criticism rests upon the judgment that the literature in which the life of a given community, or even the primitive Christian community, has taken shape, springs out of quite definite conditions and wants of life from which grows up a quite definite style and quite specific forms and categories. Thus, every literary category has its life situation. Number 5. As it passed down the sayings and stories of Jesus, the early Christian community not only put the material into certain forms, but it also modified it under the impetus of its own needs and situations. Important assumption. With this point, we move from what may be called form criticism proper, a literary enterprise, into a broader conception of the discipline in which historical judgments are being rendered that by and large do not grow out of the discipline as such. Form critics differ widely over the degree to which the early church modified and created gospel material. Bultmann, for instance, thinks the influence was huge, attributing most of the gospel material to the early church and finding relatively little that can be reliably considered to have come from the earthly ministry of Jesus. He does so because he, with many other form critics, believes that the early church was not concerned to distinguish between things Jesus said while on earth and things that he was continuing to say through the prophets in the life of the church. As Norman Perrin puts it, the modern distinction between historical Jesus and risen Lord is quite foreign to the early church. Radical historical judgments such as these are not intrinsic to form criticism, and many form critics are much more conservative in their historical assessments. Vincent Taylor is one, and there are others still more conservative who confine the influence of the early church mainly to the arrangement of material. But these are exceptions to the rule, and it must be said that the great majority of form critics have pursued their enterprise with a good measure of historical skepticism. And then number 6. Classic form critics have typically used various criteria to enable them to determine the age and historical trustworthiness of particular pericopes. And pericopes are short sayings, and that are often, we'll look at a definition of it later, or as we're saying this, I'll just ask you to look it up and to formulate a good definition. But many times pericopes were used in church services and passages of Scripture. But anyway, the age and historical trustworthiness of particular pericopes. These criteria are based on certain laws of transmission that are thought to hold good for any orally transmitted material. According to these so-called laws, people tend to 1. Lengthen their stories, 2. Add details to them, 3. Conform them more and more to their own language, and 4. Generally preserve and create only what fits their own needs and beliefs. On the basis of these laws, many form critics have declared the gospel material that is shorter, lacks details, contains Semitisms, and does not fit with the interests of the early church or first century Judaism is earlier, and thus more likely to be historical. The last criterion, usually called the criterion of dissimilarity, is especially important for the more radical form critics. By eliminating anything that was likely to have been introduced by the early church, or that could have been picked up from the Jewish milieu, advocates of this criterion claim to be able to secure a critically assured minimum number of sayings and activities on which a supposedly historical understanding of Jesus can be based. The criterion of dissimilarity, for instance, suggests that Mark 13:32, which reads, "But about that day or hour no one knows, not even the angels in heaven, nor the Son, but only the Father," end of quote, may well be original with Jesus, since it uses language not typical of Judaism, and contains a premise, which, in parentheses, Jesus' ignorance, that runs counter to a view in the early church. A fifth criterion is a byproduct of this one, holding material to be authentic that agrees with material isolated by the criterion of dissimilarity. A sixth criterion, multiple attestation, gives preference to material found in more than one stream of tradition. For example, Mark and Q, and then there's more about that below. So, some of the form criticism comes about based on hypotheses, which are guesses that scholars come up with in relation to observing certain materials. And we have to understand what assumptions they may have as they proceed to look at their hypotheses.